Hey everyone, Minutia Minute here, coming at you guys with a very special episode of the 365 Movie Challenge, because last night I finally got the opportunity to go see The Batman, starring Robert Pattinson as Batman, directed by Matthew Reeves, a movie that's getting over the moon, great reviews, great response from audiences. I'm excited to discuss it with you guys today. If you haven't had the chance to see the movie yet, I'm just going to give a thumbs up, say go see it in the theaters, and then click off this video. Come back after you've seen it because this is going to be a discussion. This isn't going to be a critique. It's not even really going to be a review, probably. It's really going to be just me trying to unpack my thoughts on this movie. But that said, if you've seen it, please stick around. Share your thoughts in the comments down below, and let's get a great discussion going about this movie, because it's going to take a little while, I think, to unpack this 3-hour Batman movie. So obviously, for those of you guys who are familiar with my channel already, you know I'm a huge Batman fan. I talk about the new Batman comic books coming out every single week, and I also am a big movie fan. Sometimes my different fandoms can kind of come into conflict a little bit. For example, a couple weeks ago I reviewed the Uncharted movie starring Tom Holland, which, from the perspective of an Uncharted fan, was largely satisfying, but from a film fan's perspective, probably not quite so much. Scores quite a bit lower. That said, I'm very happy to report that The Batman is largely a very strong quality film. Separate of being a Batman fan, I think that this movie is great. It has a very heavy dose of noir to it. I'm not sure if this is a comparison that Matthew Reeves has been making because I haven't been following like interviews or anything like that, but a lot of people are talking about this movie in the context of the movie Seven by David Fincher and just kind of a direction for like the tone of this new Batman movie, which I thought was very apt while I was watching the movie. Now, going into this movie, it's kind of an uphill battle for me, even as a Batman fan, because, if you count the Michael Keaton, Tim Burton Batman movies and the Joel Schumacher movies separately, you've got, now the fourth solo Batman franchise. You've got, Batman versus Superman sandwiched in there. We've had so many different takes on this character, and they kind of keep going back to the well, finding ways to reinvent the character. Batman is a very malleable character. There's a lot of different ways you can take him. So that helps. But when they announced this movie, even with Matt Reeves in the director's chair, I was kind of like, ugh, do I need this movie? And the answer is probably not. After the Dark Knight trilogy wrapped up, which for me was really the definitive depiction of Batman holistically, DC and Warner Brothers really did a pretty big Batman 66 push. They were able to get that TV show onto Blu-ray finally. They were rolling out comic books, cartoons, action figures. There was this big sort of resurgence of Batman 66 memorabilia. And I kind of wondered, are they kind of trying to grease the wheels to go a little bit lighter with this character in the future? Which is something I was actually kind of excited at the prospect for. Because Batman is a comic book character, and we kind of lose sight of that a little bit when we keep doing these dark, grim, realistic takes on the character. Which isn't to say that I wanted them to lighten it up to make it more appealing to McDonald's. I wanted them to lighten it up to just go in a new direction with the character. And once they hired Matt Reeves, I kind of knew that probably wasn't the direction they were going. And then sure enough, you start hearing, Christopher Nolan says he made a dark, realistic Batman film. Well, hold my beer, And now that the movie's out, everyone's really trying to like justify its existence by, pummeling the Nolan films all of a sudden. I've seen multiple articles where it's like, how did we even like those Christopher Nolan movies? Which, those are great movies. They did the same thing to Tim Burton when, the Dark Knight trilogy came out. It's ultimately just, the internet's way of rationalizing why we need a movie that we don't really need. That said, going into this movie, can you go darker and more realistic than Christopher Nolan? Absolutely. Christopher Nolan has a veneer of realism to it, but it's very stylized. In The Dark Knight, when Lucius Fox reinvented the bat suit, and it looks more like combat armor, it still looks like, combat armor with Hollywood comic book flair. The costume is a complete reinvention of what we've classically thought of as the Batman movie costume, but it still looks amazing and looks like a movie costume. And, we're just watching the trailer for the Batman, the Batman doesn't have this flashy costume. Like, as a matter of fact, it kind of looks like crap. but intentionally so. So that, it's not a bad thing necessarily. And I guess that kind of finally brings me around to like what I thought of this movie and the direction they took with it. And and this is where the movie really shined the most to me because both Christopher Nolan and Matt Reeves clearly drew a lot of inspiration from The Long Halloween. Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale did a really good job contextualizing why Gotham City is a horrible place to live. For a long time, Gotham was just, any old city that just happened to be filled with super criminals that made things, really complicated, right? And then Frank Miller kind of came around and said, no, Gotham is a complete dump. It's a horrible place to live. He didn't like living in New York, and he kind of transposed that into Gotham City, and you got this really horrible look at American big city life. But he didn't really explain or contextualize it. It was just an observation of how much it sucked. And then Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale took that and said, this is how the crime families operate. This is how they've leveraged the city's power structure, pulled the levers to, corrupt the police force, corrupt the politicians, and, corrupt the city to its core. And this is why it's so hard to get out of it. They just built like an actual universe that you could believe created a city like Gotham. It felt very real. And while Christopher Nolan's Batman movies paid lip service to that idea and kind of incorporated it, it was more interested and focused on Bruce Wayne and his journey as Batman and Commissioner Gordon and ultimately Harvey Dent and how that triumvirate kind of came together, which is also from The Long Halloween. This movie really digs into Gotham as a city. More so than any other Batman movie, this movie is about Gotham, and it's really the main central character of the movie. And that was really cool to see, and added a ton of atmosphere to the movie, more so than even Tim Burton, who, created a very stylized Gotham, but it was, a visual thing. It wasn't necessarily a character in the way that this movie portrays it. And that sensibility about Gotham spills all the way into, the character designs, the personalities of the various key players inside Gotham City, which brings us back around to like the Batman costume, which, I was like, it looks terrible, and it does, but intentionally so. And it's actually very effective because it looks like a guy put this stuff together. He did it intelligently, but ultimately, he's wearing combat boots and kind of like normal gloves with, some blades on the end of it. It doesn't look like a finished product, but it's very convincing at making you think that this is a real world vigilante that the movie is, portraying. Literally to the point where I kept thinking about those Batman cosplayers that like actually operate in cities and do like good deeds throughout the city and like walk around and look tough as if they're fighting crime, but they're not really. I don't know if you've ever seen those guys. I don't know if they're still around, but like I've seen multiple news stories about some like kind of chubby dude bro with a goatee that wears a Batman costume and like goes downtown and I assume just like helps grandma put her groceries in the car, but I don't know. The point is, as I was watching this movie, I literally kept getting flashes of those people, which I guess is, job well done. It can be really difficult not to Hollywoodify things. Even if you have a homeless person in a movie, the dirt is like on their face in like just the right way, and they look spectacular somehow, even though they're completely covered in grit. And for the most part, all the characters in this movie are not appealing to look at. They're not pretty. They're ugly people in an ugly, corrupt city, and the complete package is very well realized, in large part because of Matt Reeves' directing, but also because of the cast. I feel like Robert Pattinson looks too young to be Batman, but in the context of this Batman, he definitely works. I thought Jeffrey Wright was one of the best Commissioner Gordons ever. I'm very partial to Gary Oldman, but I would maybe have to give it to Jeffrey Wright, which Christopher Nolan did a good job of making Gordon an integral part of the story too. But this movie took it in a little bit of a different direction, because with Nolan, Batman was always at odds with the police. In this, he's at odds with the corrupt police, but he also is like directly involved in crime scenes, working with Gordon, working with the police. He's almost a deputized vigilante, almost. Like he's clearly not, but you could see him become that in the future, but not in a way that's unbelievable. Like you believe that they would take his help because he's largely doing, freelance detective work. And so seeing him working amongst the cops, investigating crime scenes and stuff like that was another highlight of the movie for me, because that was just something we didn't get with Nolan, because, the second he was in with the police force, he was out with the police force, and then he was retired, and then the series ended. And on top of that, because they spent so much time with that concept, there's a lot of great interpersonal drama between different cops, how they felt about Batman, how they interacted with Batman. There's a fantastic moment midway through when, Batman's unconscious and he ends up basically in like a interrogation room with the police, and they're all fighting about whether or not to unmask him, and he wakes up and he's like a caged animal, and it's like, yes, and the tension is just like at an all-time high while Gordon's trying to defuse the situation, work around the dirty cops, also help Batman, but also save face. And there's just a lot of complex, suspenseful beats going on all at the same time. That was maybe my favorite part of the movie as a whole, actually, was that middle portion. Which brings me to the last thing I want to talk about that I really, really loved about this movie before we get into some of the negatives, because the movie's not perfect, and that's just portraying Batman as the detective. This Batman, as you've seen in the trailers, absolutely can fight, no problem. He kicks the crap out of a lot of people in this movie. He's got the car, he does the car chases, he's got the grappling hook, he's got all the kind of typical trappings of the action Batman, so to speak. But that's not the emphasis. This movie isn't actually particularly action-packed. The action in it is very sparing up until the very end of the movie. For the most part, this movie is actually violent. There are short bursts of intense violence. It's PG-13, so it's fairly bloodless, but the implication of violence is very front and center. It doesn't feel like a PG-13 when you're watching it. And most of the driving narrative is around following the clues, getting to the bottom of the Riddler's riddles, but then also just investigating crime scenes and picking up on little threads and investigating those threads. Along the way, as he's trying to investigate, what's a rat with wings? It's, could it be the Batman? Could it be the Penguin? Could it be Carmine Falcone? He's investigating all of these things, but not doing it in a way that he's just pushing buttons. Like, he's got a pencil out. You know what I mean? And, like, that was very satisfying to see. We don't get the Dark Knight detective almost ever, and including in Christopher Nolan. Like, that's not something he ever really nailed either. And going into the movie, I told my wife, like, I really want to see a detective movie. And to be honest, I was a little surprised we actually got it, because, you look at the trailers and it looks kind of like nonstop action, and it's not. It's very low key most of the movie, very atmospheric, very slow moving. When Batman comes into a scene, he does the Tim Burton slow walk. The only difference in this is they add the spurs of a cowboy boot every time he takes a step, which, chef's kiss. That was great. So obviously we've talked a ton about what I loved about this movie, but we've got to cool our jets a little bit. Let's come down to earth and have an honest discussion about the problems with this movie, because it is not perfect. It might be flawlessly directed, but it's not a perfect movie. I have one thing that bothered me as a Batman fan, and one thing that bothered me from a narrative, like, film perspective, and both of them to me would hold it back from being best Batman movie ever, although this is definitely top 3 for sure. I'm not sure where it falls overall. It's going to take some time, some distance before I can really rank it, in the grand Batman mythos, but very strong outing overall. The things that hold it back, first of all, as a Batman fan, I didn't like the portrayal of Bruce Wayne. There's always a discussion, and I feel like this has become trite now. I think it was maybe clever 40 years ago when when people started thinking of it this way, but now it just feels played out, which is that, Bruce Wayne is the mask and Batman is who he really is. In this movie, there is no Bruce Wayne. He is Batman the whole movie. If he's dressed as Bruce Wayne, it is to go somewhere Batman can't go. So he's never not Batman. And that's certainly a fair take on the character. I don't really have a problem with it, but I really am partial to what Christopher Nolan did, which was they made Bruce Wayne an interesting character. They looked back on the Tim Burton movies and said, every time it's just Bruce Wayne, the movie gets kind of boring. And so they built Bruce Wayne as a character who happens to wear a Batman costume. And I think that they hit a really nice note because there's the Bruce Wayne, the facade that, the public sees and the media sees, and then there's the real Bruce Wayne, who's like a real believable person. And he puts on another facade that is the Batman. In this, it kind of felt like they said Bruce Wayne's not interesting, Batman's interesting. And so rather than have a bunch of boring stuff with Bruce Wayne, we just won't put Bruce Wayne in it at all. And again, like, maybe that's nitpicking, but to me, like, it is part of the balance of the character. Like, both of those things should be able to coexist. Otherwise, something isn't quite right. In this case, they're taking sort of the most extreme take on the character that they can, which is cool. Like, it works as kind of an Elseworlds. It doesn't work for me as the definitive Batman, though. And that kind of leads me to, like, a future criticism, which is when we get the inevitable The Batman sequel, because this isn't really a movie I want a sequel to. Like, this feels like a one and done, like, here is a DC Black Label Batman take on the character. Like, that's what this felt like, brought to life on the big screen. There's a tease at the end for more movies, and that's when the movie lost me. Like, what interested me was that Elseworlds take on Batman, which I guess we're kind of spilling into the narrative problem I had with the movie, so let's dig into that, which is the ending of the film. So, right towards the end of the second act, beginning of the third act, is when the Riddler is caught. And, when you have a movie that's about a serial killer and you're investigating that serial killer, typically the movie ends once the serial killer is caught or brought to justice. Now, because this movie's channeling Seven, that's really the beginning of the third act because the killer still has one final play. But the difference with Seven was that was a much more intimate play that involved all the main characters and brought them all together for this very intimate moment at the end. In Batman, it didn't really need that, but it felt like they got to a point in the script where it's like, okay, the movie's over, and they went back and read, and they're like, oh no, there's not enough Batman stuff in this Batman movie. It actually felt a little bit like Tim Burton's Batman when he gets to the Belfry Tower and he's fighting off a bunch of random Joker goons just to, like, increase the punch level in the movie because there wasn't enough punching yet. And this is where the movie really sort of devolves into standard Batman stuff. There's a lot of grappling hooks, flying around, jumping around. There is a cataclysmic event in which the Riddler has a bunch of bombs placed throughout the city that causes the levees to break, that floods the whole town. Like, all that stuff was not interesting to me. Like, I've seen that. Like, Christopher Nolan did epic Batman. By the third one, there's a nuclear bomb in the city. So, like, you're never going to top that. You don't need to top that. You were doing way better when this was just an intimate story about a serial killer. The movie does use it to grow the Batman character overall, because up to that point, Batman is vengeance. He says that in the trailer. And he realizes towards the end that it's more than about being about vengeance, and it's about lifting people up and lifting the city up and being a beacon of hope. Fine, but again, we've seen that in the Christopher Nolan movies, and it doesn't really fit with the character that they've built up to this point. It really felt like it was more a bridge to get you to another Batman movie. So that stuff really ground the movie to a halt a little bit. And because the movie's 3 hours, like, I started getting twitchy in my seat because, 2.5 hours in and we're going into the big spectacle action finale. The other thing that they dig into in this is, like, incels. So, like, the Riddler has, these followers online, and they're going to go to Gotham City Garden and start shooting the place up at the end of the movie, which is a really dark, very serious direction to take the movie. But the problem is, they're really there just to be fodder for Batman to punch, because you have to have the Batman punching at the end. And that bothered me. The radicalization of people online and what that looks like is such a complicated question. No one has the answers to that yet. No one really understands it. It's too politicized for people to have an honest discussion about what's really going on in those kinds of situations. And so as dark and intense as that idea is in a Batman movie, and how it probably fit the tone of the movie that they were making, ultimately the result, in which Batman just comes in and kicks the crap out of everybody, made it feel like they weren't really tackling that issue. It made it feel like they were trivializing it. And that was probably the single biggest ding I had against the movie, was the whole incel subplot. I get what they were going for. I think that they didn't rise to the occasion of the material. Like, if they were going to really go there, they needed to really go there in a more serious way. Or they could have just skipped it. Like, I would have been very satisfied if the end of the movie was Batman defeated by the Riddler. Like, that would be an incredibly satisfying noir ending to your film. Like, at the end of the day, you get the villain, but the villain actually got you. Like, I think that would have been a great ending to the movie. But long story short, this was a good movie. Only a couple little problems, mostly towards the end. You probably won't feel the runtime on this. We went to see it at the Alamo Draft House, and so, they said they were bringing checks out 40 minutes before the end of the movie. And I felt like I had been watching it for 20 minutes, and all of a sudden the checks rolled out. And so even though it's a slower paced movie, it's very engrossing. It actually kind of feels like you're watching a mini series more than you're watching a movie that you're just binge watching. So it's not hard to get through. It isn't till the very end when you start to feel the runtime a little bit. But judging on how long this review is probably going to end up being, I probably shouldn't judge this movie on its runtime. I hope you guys go check the movie out. I think it's very, very good. If you haven't checked it out and you watch this whole video, I guess shame on you. You should have waited. But if you have seen it, again, please leave a comment below. I would love to know your thoughts on the movie. Let's get a discussion going. And I hope you guys have a great week in movies. And I will be back tomorrow with the next episode in my 365 movie challenge. Thanks for watching.